Hello, my name is Eric Monson, and I work for a department within the Duke University Libraries called the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences. Today's workshop, we're going to learn how to use Tableau to visualize survey data, and specifically what's called Likert scale data. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Before I leave this slide, I'll be repeating this link later on. This bit.ly link, Tableau for Survey Data 2022, that's case sensitive. If you go to that link, it's a Dropbox folder where you can just hit download. It'll download a zip file of the resources we're going to use today. So it has a PDF of these slides. There's a PDF of the handout that I'm going to be following for the step-by-step instructions for the Tableau work. It also has the data that we're going to use, links to where I got the data, and there's also a Tableau workbook that's there that's kind of the final version of what we're going to be doing. But to begin with here, I'm covering survey data not just because I think everybody is going to be using survey data with Tableau, but I think using this type of data is a great intermediate training in Tableau itself. So we're going to cover things like how do you do pivots, a pivot in Tableau to go from the wide format of data to the tall format that Tableau likes, how to form relationships between multiple tables, which is like a database join. It's just a little bit more flexible, and how to do things like make dual axis plots that weren't covered in my intro to Tableau video. Now, the data we're going to use today was obtained from the site called Data Revelations. Steve Wexler, who runs that, has done an enormous amount of work on how to visualize survey data in Tableau. And most of what I know, I've learned from him and his materials. There's a link at the bottom here for where we got the data. And it's a great resource. I'm just going to be going over a few things here that because there's actually a lot of content on his site, so it takes a while to get through all of that. We will be learning how to visualize these Likert scale responses, things like stacked bar charts. This happens to be stacked bars with an overlaid second axis showing average responses, but also things like slope charts where you can take that average response and then split it according to different demographic categorical variables. And I think this can really help you see patterns in your data. But let's talk a little bit about the data that we're going to be using so you'll understand its form and what it's like in case you don't do surveys. When we do surveys, often there are some sorts of demographic data that we collect on the people that are answering the survey. So here we have questions like gender, location, what generation people are from. Those will help us make comparisons. How do the responses differ between people from different places in the world or different, basically, ages or genders? But then we have the responses themselves, which here we're just going to focus on the Likert scale questions. And Likert was the name of a person. And these types of questions are like this. These specific ones we'll be looking at indicate the degree with which you agree that these qualities are important in a potential romantic partner. We've got good job skills, good sense of humor, high intelligence, things like that. And then this scale from not at all, small degree, moderate, high, very high degree, that's what's called the Likert scale. There are various types of these. We could have how much do you agree? Do you very much agree or do you not agree at all? Do you disagree? How important is something? There's a lot of different forms that these Likert scale questions can take, but it's these kind of graduated, how much do you agree? How important do you think things are that we'll be looking at? Now, the original survey data that comes off of a system like Qualtrics, which is the one that we have access to here at Duke, has a certain form that we're going to need to deal with. And that form is that Each row is one respondent, one person that answered all the questions, and this first section is what we call the demographic information. So here in this really simple example, we just have a respondent ID, and then the only demographic variable is what state that person was from. Then we have each question, and in those columns is the answer that that person gave to these questions. And this is what we call wide format, where we have multiple questions spread across multiple columns. It's a really nice compact form for the data. It's nice to look at, it makes sense. But the problem is that Tableau wants a slightly different form that's not quite so efficient or good to look at, but it's really good for analysis and visualization. What it wants is this tall or tidy format. Tidy is a term that's used within the R statistical language world. And here we have kind of one column for each type of information. The original data had question responses in multiple columns and had question IDs as the headers to columns. What Tableau wants is one column with question IDs and one column that's going to contain all of the different responses that people gave. And now you can see what we have to do that is the respondent IDs and their demographic information gets repeated for each question that these people answered. Okay, so that's the form that we want. There's some other rearrangements of the data that are handy. Having all of the question responses in one table like we've just been talking about is really nice. That makes a table of all the responses. Sometimes it's really handy, though, to have information about the questions themselves in a separate table. Okay, and that would be linked to this responses table through this question ID. That's how we can make this relationship, or we can join through that. And what that helps you do is it can then hold things like, what's the wording for the question? Maybe what's a short wording for the question if the question wording is quite long. It can also hold things like what type of question it is, because yes, no types of questions might require a different type of visualization, or you might prefer a different type of visualization than Likert scale questions or check all that apply sort of questions. Okay, so having a separate table helps us update that information and keep track of it separately and not have to have it all in one table. Okay, so that's often really handy. Sometimes it's also handy to have the demographics in their own table. That would be if you're trying to update information about the people that took the survey. Maybe there's a certain amount of demographic information that you get right off of the questions, but maybe you want to join in other pieces of information that you get from some other source. Maybe you want to relate, what's the population of each of the states that people come from, thinking that that may have a relationship to how they answer. You then have the flexibility of joining that information in to the demographics table. Now in our example today, we're just going to have the demographics and responses are going to be together in one table, but the questions will have a separate table that we'll form a relationship with. Then Tableau takes all of these separate tables, and if necessary to do any particular visualization, we'll join them together into one big table form where now you have not only the respondents, the demographic information, question information, and the responses all in one. Tableau can do this transformation from the wide form that we start with to the tall form itself these days. Originally it couldn't, but now you can do what's called a pivot. That's what we're going to do today, is take these questions and pivot them to get the tall form. But there are times when it's handy to, or you may have a preference to do that transformation in another program first. And one example is you can use this, the data cleaning and transformation software called OpenRefine. It's a free open source software. You can use that to do what's called a transpose data across columns into rows, and then use that to just open directly in Tableau. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to take you through a hands-on exercise in Tableau visualizing some Likert scale data. We're going to import the data, make some stacked bars, dual axis plot out of that, and then a slope chart. And then there's going to be a later section of videos that talks about various data issues that it depends on where your data is coming from, what your preferences are, which ones of these you might use. But things like bringing your data in instead of in an Excel workbook like we're going to do, you might want to hook directly into a survey system like Qualtrics using the Qualtrics Web Data Connector. We have access to that here at Duke. You may want to download the data from Qualtrics and try to use that directly in Tableau. And I'll show you some issues that come up when you try to do that. And then we're just going to be importing the textual responses, not their kind of numeric equivalent in the main part of the workshop today, but there are times when it's really handy to have both the text and the numeric responses, where the numeric is when you give those Likert scale answers, say values from 1 to 5 instead of the textual not at all, very little, things like that. Okay, but there are some issues that arise with that, and so in those later videos I'll take you through that. But right now what we're going to do is do the hands-on exercise with Tableau. We'll be using Tableau Public, which is a free free software, not open source. You download it from Tableau itself. Here again is that bit.ly link for downloading the resources for today's workshop. And in the next section, we'll open up Tableau and start visualizing. So for this hands-on portion, we are going to be following along with, here's the downloaded resources. We're going to be following along with this handout. I have a PDF there in the resources. I have a copy printed out here. I'm going to try to follow it as directly as possible. So either you can be following along as you're working along with me, or at least this PDF would be a reference for you later for remembering exactly what we did. So that's what we're going to be doing. The data we're going to be using comes in an Excel workbook. And again, this is from Data Revelations. It's some sample survey data they have where we have table of, you can see the respondent IDs, some demographic information, a couple of different types of questions. We're going to be dealing with these Likert scale ones at the end where we got question IDs across the top. And this is the textual responses. There's also the numeric version of these responses. And then in a separate sheet is the questions table where it has the question ID that we can use to form the relationship, what the wording was, different things about grouping or the question type that we'll use within Tableau as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to be dealing with. I am going to just open up Tableau Public and start working on this. So the first thing we need to do is connect to our data. It's in a Microsoft Excel workbook. I'm just going to navigate to my downloads, to where I save this. Here is our Data Revelations Sample Survey Subset workbook. If I click open on that, we will see the different sheets over to the left here. And what we want to do is drag this data labels table over into the drag tables here area. When we do that, we get a preview of the data and some things about the columns. What we want to do first is to do this, what's called a pivot in Tableau, from having our questions across multiple column question IDs across the column headers and the question responses spread through multiple columns. We're going to start by clicking on the Q0 column, somewhere in the middle here. You just don't want to hit this little caret or the ABC section that sets the data type. And then we're going to scroll sideways all the way to the end. I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to click on the last question. So I have all of those questions and responses selected. And then I'm going to go to, we can do it in any of these columns, but I'm just going to go to the last one. I'm going to hit this little caret menu and go down to this option Pivot. When I hit Pivot, it now transforms this so you can see all of our column headers are in a single column. All of our responses from the body of the tables are here in this pivot field values column. And we've got our respondent IDs, demographic information repeated for each person. We can scroll down and see each respondent ID. Okay, so I want to rename these so they're better names. I'm just going to double click. I could right click and say rename. I just tend to double click in these column names, and I'm going to call this one question ID. Just hit return. And this one, pivot field values, I'm going to call response label. All right, so now we have that data in here for our responses, but we want to form a relationship with the table of the questions information. So I'm in the second section, define a table relationship. I am going to drag this questions sheet here into this tables area, and you notice right away it forms this orange curly line. Okay, that's what we want. We just don't want to bring it directly under that data labels, because then it'll try to form what's called a union, which is like a vertical concatenation. We just want to let go of it somewhere in this area where that curvy line is formed. And you can see it's trying to make a relationship, but it doesn't know how. We've got this red flag here. So what we want to do is to define the relationship here in this lower left part. You'll hear me pausing every once in a while because I'm reading through my instructions, making sure I follow things in the correct order. There's a little note in the instructions about the names, but what we have to do is say, how are we going to join these two things together? How are we going to form this relationship? So from our data labels, we're going to select question ID. And then a little confusingly, when we go over to our questions table, questions sheet, we have what's called question ID 1. Now in the original workbook, in the original table, it was just called question ID, but when Tableau sees two columns come in that have the same name, it starts to put numbers after it. So it's still the same info, you just pick question ID 1. Once it has that relationship, now it can show previews of the data. We can either click on the data labels table and see that info, or we can click on the questions table and see the information from that table. Okay. One thing I do commonly, though, before I go and start visualizing is hide a little bit of the information that I'm not going to use. Here, I've actually got two versions of my question IDs because I used it. It's in each table. I'm using it to form that relationship. I will often just hide one of them. So I might take this question ID 1 from the questions table and hit on the little menu and go down to hide and click that. It just keeps my my sheets a little bit cleaner. All right, we're done getting our data in. Let's go and start visualizing. We just click on sheet 1 over here to go to a new workbook. I'm going to close this show me. I hardly ever use show me. I use it every once in a while for forming histograms or box plots, things like that, but most of the time I just hide it over there. Now we're in the section called visualize number of people answering each question. Now one of the optional things here is when you have data that's been brought in multiple tables where you formed a relationship, the default view is to show each of the separate tables and what are your fields underneath those, the dimensions and measures for each. Sometimes when I don't really care what table things came from, I will go up to this little menu in the upper right of that data pane and go down, and instead of group by data source table, I'll pick group by folder. That's kind of the way it looks if you just have a single table, and I think this is kind of handy in this case. We don't really need to know where the variables come from. Okay, let's start visualizing. I'm going to first drag wording, which is the wording of the question, to rows. I'm going to drag it up here. I could drag it down below for that drop fields here. I'm going to drag it right to the rows. Okay, that's all my question wordings. Now I'm going to drag respondent ID, or this what's called resp ID, but I'll call it respondent ID, over to columns. I'm just going to say add all members. But what we're going to do is click on the respondent ID pill, and instead of showing all the respondent IDs, what we want to do is create a measure, and we want to pick count distinct. So we want to count the number of distinct respondent IDs that answered each of these questions. When I do that, now I've got basically 845 value bar charts for all of these. Not very interesting yet. Let's first filter, before we get to more details, let's filter out the questions that aren't the ones that we want to visualize right here. So I'm going to go down to just the Likert scale questions by dragging question type over to filters. When I do that, remember that when we define a filter, we're defining what gets through the filter. So I want to choose Likert scale questions to get through the filter, and it'll block everything else. When I hit OK, now we're down to just the Likert scale question wordings. But this just shows the number of people. What we want to do is make some distinctions between what all of these 845 people answered for each of these questions. We can do that by dragging response label to the right of question wording. So I'm going to drag it into rows. You can see that orange triangle showing up to the right of the wording when I let go of response label. Now we can see a bar chart of the number of people that answered each of these responses for each of these questions. Okay. Now we're starting to get someplace. We can make some comparisons. One thing we notice, though, when we look at these response labels is they're not necessarily in the order that we would think of. We got high degree, but we got very high degree down at the bottom. One easy way to reorder these is just to drag them around in the visualization. So I'm clicking my mouse down, holding, dragging very high degree up to the top, high, moderate, then not at all should be below small. Okay, so that's a little bit better. We can see kind of this shape of all the wordings. We can make comparisons this way, but it's kind of handy sometimes to have each of these levels of response be a different color. So I'm going to remap the color scale by dragging response label to color. When we do that, we can see that we got a different color for each of these now. This is okay, but we've got a couple things that are getting in the way, making it maybe a little harder to make the comparisons we would like. One is these nulls. We've got nulls up here, and just, people didn't answer that. There's a few ways we could filter those out. I could drag response label up to filters and exclude nulls, but I can actually just click on that null in the visualization itself. When I click on it, I get a little bit of a menu that comes in, and I can say exclude. I can pick exclude right from there, and you see what it did is it created a new entry in the filters for response label. If we go to edit filter there, we can see that nulls have been excluded. When you click exclude, that's saying what is the filter going to block instead of what it's going to let through. So we're excluding nulls, but we did it through there. We could have also done it from that color shelf. If I undo here, I can go over to null and do the same thing. In the color legend, hit exclude, and now we get rid of our nulls. Okay, so at this point, this looks okay, but the colors that Tableau chose by default are a set of different hues for each of these responses. And this is the type of color map that I would use if I had an unordered set of categories, what we'd call a nominal set of categories. That would be like apples, oranges, pears, watermelons. There's no natural ordering for those fruits. Here, though, not at all through very high degree. That's an ordinal or an ordered set of categories. And so one option that might be a good choice is to use a ramp of color here instead of just different hues. So I'm going to change my color palette. I can hit under the colors in the marks here. I can hit edit colors. I tend to, for whatever reason, go up to the color legend just because that's usually where I'm seeing the colors. I click the little caret menu and go to edit colors from there. It gets to the same place. Now, this is the default 10 hue Tableau palette. Those are really nice colors, but if we click on this, I don't know, the blue part here, we've got a lot of different types of color palettes. All of these ramps, we want to choose one of those. I'm going to choose from this orange gold set. And at this point, what I really want is very high degree to be dark. So I could click on very high degree, click on the dark color, high degree, I could go down. I don't really like doing it one by one like this because I got 5 choices and it's hard for me to know how to evenly pick between the colors here and get it to be a nice ramp. We can hit assign palette and that will automatically just assign that color ramp to those 5 categories. That's great, except for the fact that I want it reversed. Okay, I want the darkest to be very high degree. Just having looked at these visualizations, I think there's not something, intrinsically right about that. You could use the lightest color for very high and the darkest for not at all. When I look at these visualizations, I think it feels more natural to me to have the darkest emphasizing very high degree and the lightest be not at all. Okay, unfortunately, Tableau doesn't just have a reverse button on here. And so what I do typically is there's a couple ways to do it. With the choices I have here, I'll hit cancel. What I'll do is just drag these colors in the color legend until I have the reverse ordering. Since Tableau will always color the same categories, the same colors throughout all of your visualizations, you really only have to do this once. So even though it's a bit of a pain, it's not that bad. So I put them manually in the reverse order. I go back to edit colors. I go to my orange gold palette for the ramp, and then I say assign palette. Now it looks like the right direction of the ramp. I'll hit OK, and then I just reorder manually in the color legend to get them back in the right order. Now another option would be if you do have numeric responses along with, you could sort the items within this legend according to the numeric response field, according to the max or the min of the values within those categories. Do it descending or do it ascending first, map the colors, do it descending back how the way you want it in the end. That's also handy and works, but here we just have the textual responses. All right, so that was the long way around to just saying now we've got this nice color ramp. It kind of helps us see the high to low on all of these. We've got a bar chart for each of these questions, and we could make comparisons this way. But I find this form to be, I don't know, it's very long. It's a little hard. You can look within one question, but it's a little hard to compare between questions. When I have kind of side-by-side grouped bars like this, I tend to get a little bit of kind of color strobing. When I look at this, it's a little hard for me to pick it out and look between these. So what we want to do is create stacked bars instead. Okay, so I'm going to leave this sheet as it is. I'm going to just rename this sheet bars. So I'm just double clicking in there. I could also right click and go to rename. So I'm going to name this, and then I'm going to right click on it and go to duplicate sheet. So now with this one, I'm going to create the stacked bars, and it's actually quite easy because all we need to do, so I'm in the section of the instructions called stacked bars for compact visualization. I can click on and say remove on this pill for the response label. I could click on it and hit the delete button. I usually just drag it out into no place, but that's just my personal preference. When we get rid of that response label, that's all we really need to stop making that vertical distinction between the responses, but we're still coloring according to the response label, and that creates a stacked bar. You can see if we drag that out of there, we would just get our original blue bars. If I undo, get the colors back in there. I've got our stacked bars according to these responses, ordered in the way that the color legend is. It's going to be that ordering from the end to the beginning of the bars. All right, so this one I'm going to rename stacked bars. We might want to do some things like make a little bit more space for these labels, make these bars a little thicker. If we hover between two labels here, you can see that the cursor becomes a double-sided arrow. That's when I know I can click down, hold, and drag to make the bars thicker. You can see that some of the question wordings, though, this still isn't quite fat enough to get to the point where I can get double lines here. I'll get 2 lines of text if I go far enough. But say if I was a little less than that, I don't know where I want this. It doesn't really matter. If I want to make more space for these question wordings, I can just hover between the wording and the beginning of the bars, hold down and drag, and now I've got space for 1 line per question. I think that looks pretty nice. Now, one of the problems we have at this point, though, is you can see what we're doing is still counting the number of distinct respondent IDs. And it looks like we had more nulls for some of these questions than others. We, looks like we're getting, 400 and some. We had 425 for some of these, but not others. It's probably, I don't know how many this is. We would have to, if I take this out, I can see 419, 418, 414. Okay. What we care about, I'm going to hit undo to get the colors back. What we care about usually, instead of the number of people that said things, when we want to make comparisons between the responses to these different questions, we often want to look at what percent of people said, say, very high degree or high degree compared to what they responded in the other questions. Okay, so we would like to get to a percent of the total here. There's actually a really easy way to do that. We're in the next section called switch to percent of total rather than count of respondents. And it says quick table calculation. And that's what we're going to do. If we go to this pill on the column shelf that's called count distinct respondent ID, if I click on that pill, towards the bottom, it says add table calculation or quick table calculation. This is the one I want, quick table calculation. Then I want to choose percent of total. When I do that, we can see that the scale changed. So now I have 100% at the top, but these don't all go to 100% like we would expect. The wording of what we just chose, table calculation, is how to think about this. If we have a table of numbers, we can calculate the percent of total either down the columns or across the rows. And it turns out that the default is down in this case. But we want to change that. That's not what we want. We want total across. And so if we again choose this pill for count distinct respondent ID, you can see it has this little delta here. That's the indication that it has a table calculation. We go to compute using, and instead of table down, we want to choose table across. When I choose table across, now all of these go to 100%, and I can hover over here, and it says the percent of the people that answered that particular choice. At this point, it's calculating what we want, but the x-axis label here, percent of total distinct count of respondent IDs, that's not very human readable, so I can either right-click on this axis and go to Edit Axis, or I can just double-click on that axis and it'll bring up this dialog. I'm going to change the axis title to just percent of respondents. And then just remember, with this type of dialog, don't hit at the bottom. That bottom is reset. To close it, you have to hit the little X in the upper right. All right, so that looks pretty good. The thing that gets in the way at this point of making nice comparisons between, what do different people answer for each of these questions, is, I would say the biggest one is the ordering of the questions themselves, because we can see the values of these bars of what people answered are kind of jumping up and down. When you have a simple bar chart, what I tell people is to sort it usually with the longest bars first down to the shortest ones. So usually you sort it descending instead of alphabetical, which is the default. Here you can see the question wordings are just in alphabetical order. That's fine for lookup, but it's not great for seeing the patterns in the data. Okay, so we could sit here and try to reorder everything manually and try to come up with a good order. Since there aren't that many questions, it wouldn't take us that long. But a better approach might be to order according to some sort of numeric equivalent of what people's responses were. Now, if we had downloaded not only the text version of the responses, but we had joined in, downloaded and joined in the numeric version, we could start to work with the average numeric response for each of these questions. We don't have that right now, so I'm going to show you an alternative that can work for you sometimes. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to pay attention to anybody who answered either very high degree or high degree, and basically calculate kind of the percent of the people that answered one of those two compared to the other stuff. Okay? To do that, we're going to create a calculated field. That's basically just creating a new column in our data. We could do it, we could just right click somewhere over here on the left hand side in this data pane and go to create calculated field. Often I will go to the thing that I know I'm going to use, like response label here, click on the pill, go down to create, and then to calculated field. When I do that, all it does is pre-populate response label in here, which often I end up deleting anyway because it's a little unhandy to try to fit it into into my typing of this calculation, but we'll leave it here for now. You always want to make sure that you change the names so you don't end up with a bunch of calculated fields called calculation 1, calculation 2. So we're going to rename this high response, and then we're going to test, we're going to make a conditional statement, test if, and when I start typing if, it brings up choices. If I hit return over one of them, it will pick them. That just makes the uppercase version in this instance. I could use the lowercase version, it would be just fine. Tableau doesn't care, but I'm going to use if response label equals, and I tend to use 2 equal signs just because in a lot of programming languages, a single equal sign is for assignment, but for SQL and for other things, a single equals works, and it works here too. Response label equals, and then I'm going to type very high degree, and this is exactly how it's written in my data. It has to match with the capitalization, everything. I can use either single quotes or double quotes. Tableau doesn't care. Very high degree, or, and here again, I can, once I'm typing it, I can pick or response label, and I start typing RES, and it gives me the choices. I'll pick response label equals high degree. So if it's very high degree or high degree, then 1, else 0, and then at the end of a conditional statement, you always have to type end so it knows that it's done. Okay? So if response label equals very high degree or response label equals high degree, then in this new column called high response, I'm going to have the value of 1. Otherwise, if it's not one of those answers for that person's response to this question, I'm going to put a 0, and that's it. Okay, that's my calculation, that's my new column, and we're going to be able to use that. So I'll click OK. And now what I want to do is start incorporating that high response into my plot. So I'm going to drag high response to the right of this count distinct respondent ID. When you do that, you can see a separate bar chart for this other measure here, and it defaults to sum of the high response. Now, I don't really want the sum. What I'm going to do is change this to an average. So I go up to the pill for sum of high response. I go down to measure sum, and instead I pick average. And now for these two separate visualizations, this isn't exactly what we want. It looks a little screwy right now, but notice we've got these two pills on the columns, two visualizations, and we have two areas. We actually have three right now in this marks card. We've got one for everything that's showing up. The common thing amongst them is that it's colored by its automatic type of marks, and they're colored by the response label. But we've got one for the count distinct respondent ID section, and then we've got one for the average high response section here. In that average high response section, I don't want to be coloring by the response label. So I'm just going to drag that out of there. Oops. Get rid of it. Now this looks a little closer to what we want. We've got a bar, a gray bar for the average of the high responses for each of these questions across all of the respondents. And at this point, I could sort according to that, and I would have my questions, my stacked bars sorted properly. I'm going to undo that for a second and show you that we've got some other options as well, but really you can choose to do it whenever you like. So I've got my average high response, but these are in two separate visualizations right now. And what I want to do is to create what's called a dual axis plot so that these high responses will be somehow on top of the stacked bars. The way I do that is to go up these pills on the column shelf, click on one of them on the little drop-down menu, and go down to this choice dual axis that's towards the bottom. When I choose that, this is not how I want it to look. It is very common to make certain choices within Tableau that gets you down a kind of a strange path, and you have to undo it. We already did that with, say, our average high responses being colored according to the response labels. Here, when it creates a dual axis plot, it has to find some sort of representation that it can show both types at once, and so it always defaults to doing the same representation for both. Okay, and in this case, circles is the default. What I want to do is to go to this count distinct respondent ID card in the marks card here. And in this one, I don't want automatic. I want to manually change that back to bars. Okay, so now I've got my stacked bars back. And then in the average high response one, these circles are fine, but I have a preference for using open circles instead of solid circles for this sort of representation. So I'm going to click on automatic and instead choose shape. And you can see that open circles are the default for the shape. I could choose other shapes here from the shape part in the marks card. That's looking pretty good. I don't really like the gray though. It doesn't show up very well. So I'm going to go hit color, and still in this average high response, I'm going to click on color, and I'm going to choose white. And the white looks fine. It's just maybe a little bright for me when I look at it over here. So what I like to do is just decrease the opacity a bit. I don't know, I'm going to put it around 70%, something like that. Whatever you think looks good. What I like about white with some basically adding transparency or decreasing the opacity is that now each of these circles kind of takes on the color of the bar below it. And I just think that looks pretty elegant. Okay. Now this is the time when the instruction sheet tells you to do the sorting. We can go to this average high response axis, and when we hover over an axis, we see a numeric axis, we see this little sort icon show up. So we can click on this. Now that sorts according to the average high response, and we get our bars ordered, and we get an indicator here with this circle. We get a little bit of an indicator of how the average high responses drop off, but it's kind of de-emphasized a little bit. Our focus is probably a little bit more on the bars themselves, and we can see how those vary question to question. Now with this ordering, it's a little easier to make comparisons between these different responses to the questions. The final thing that we're going to do is, when we look at this sort of representation here, I think this is really nice for making detailed comparisons between the answers that people gave, how many people answered very high degree or high degree for each of these questions. That comparison is pretty easy. What becomes difficult is if we want to start making some breakdown comparisons saying, okay, what did different genders, in this case, the gender in this sample data is just broken into binary, male, female, which isn't great, but that's how it is for the sample data. So what we would do to make comparisons is maybe drag gender after wording. When we do that, we see we have female-male breakdown, and we can make comparisons here, but I feel like I have trouble looking at this. There's so much detail with the combination of all of the different individual levels of responses to the Likert scale questions, plus the male-female breakdown within each of these questions. You can make comparisons, but I find it slightly confusing. Okay. What I find a little easier to do is to look here on the average of the high responses, which is a very coarse measure. Like there's nothing to say that it's really right to say that a high degree or very high degree is a 1 and the rest are zeros, or even the numeric responses, assigning these 1 through 5. These responses aren't necessarily linear. What people mean by very high isn't necessarily 5 times bigger than what they mean for not at all. So the average high response or the average response, numeric response, is not great, but it still gives us some indication of how much people said kind of positive versus negative, and it's much easier to make the comparisons across our demographic splits with that really maybe oversimplified measure. Okay, so I'm going to hit undo here and get rid of my gender split, and I'm going to create instead what's called a slope chart. So I'm going to create a new sheet here. I'm going to just go ahead and rename this slope chart right from the beginning. This time I'm going to drag wording to columns. So this is going to have a different orientation. So wording to columns, I'm going to filter just to the Likert scale questions. So drag question type to filters, only let through Likert scale. Okay, so now I've got less questions. I'm going to take the response label and I'm going to exclude nulls on that just right from the beginning so I don't have to bother doing it later. Now I'm going to drag high response to rows. You can see the default is to do sum of the high response as a bar chart. I don't want the sum of the high response just like before. I would rather go from measure sum and instead choose average. So now here's my average. I can sort the bars at this point. I'm just going to do it on the axis. I could also do it up here on the toolbar, but I tend to do it on the axis. Okay, so here's our average sorted. That's basically exactly what we saw here, this pattern of the circles. But now this is where we want to start splitting according to different demographics. So just like before, after wording, I'm going to drag gender. Now I've got these pairs of bars, which I still feel like are not super easy to look at. I wish in all of these, if we did the demographic splits, I wish Tableau would give you an option for putting more space between these groups instead of just putting a line. I think that use of proximity would make it easier for me to see the patterns, but that's not an option. So what I like, instead of these bars, I like changing the marks from automatic to line. And that is partly because Line orientation is what they call a pre-attentive visual attribute, where we can really quickly see patterns. As long as there aren't a lot of other confusing things in the way, we can really quickly see patterns in the slopes of lines. Okay, so changing that, again, a really rough measure. We've just got this average high response, but we can see how it differs female to male. We got an upslope here, we got down, 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 but we do have an up for ability to lift heavy objects, and we have up for these last two. So we can see those groupings really easily. I like to make a couple of other changes here that aren't on the instruction sheet. I tend to click on color, and not only can you change the color and opacity there, but towards the bottom there's these markers options, and the middle one is called all. So that adds these little dots on top of the lines, so it helps me see the ends of the lines and focus on those a little bit more. I like that. And then I tend to bump the size up a little bit, so I tend to go maybe to that first click. Makes the lines a little bit more emphasized with respect to all this white space and the different words. I'll maybe change the color to the not default color. I can do things like that. That part's not super important, but I will usually make some extra space for the question wordings, again, by hovering between those wordings and the rest of the visualization. And so this looks pretty good. This is basically what we want. Quick comparison for demographic splits. I could, instead of gender, I could split on generation and see a little line chart for how this goes with generation. What this also allows us to do is to do a combination of maybe splitting male-female, but also split with color on something like generation. Okay, so now we can see, because we have this oversimplified average high response, we can add more detail in these categorical demographic splits and see patterns in our data that really would have been hidden otherwise. So things like, there's a really big difference between traditionalists, which are, I think in this case, the oldest generation. I think baby boomers must come near traditionalists. The older crowd here sees making good coffee very differently, women to men, than the younger generations. We've got millennials see it a little bit the same as the traditionalists, but you can see that the traditionalists have a very different pattern in most of these questions than the rest of the generations when you split male-female in these demographics. Similarly, we could look at the location where people came from as a color instead. In this case, Antarctica has such low statistics that I would tend to exclude that. But here you can see that Asia has different responses. South America from Europe and North America have closer responses on some of these questions, not on others. But again, these sorts of comparisons, I think, would be hard to make with other types of plots, especially with seeing all the details of these stacked bars. But going to the simplified slope chart, it makes those patterns much more obvious. The data we used in the hands-on tutorial was very nice, but it's not quite as complicated as the data that comes directly out of the Qualtrics survey system. So in these sections, I want to cover a few things that you can do with your Qualtrics data. The first will be getting your data directly, hooking up with a live link through the Qualtrics web data connector. That requires Tableau desktop. You can't use Tableau public for that. Then we'll talk about if you export files like comma separated value, tab separated value, or Excel files, using those files directly in Tableau. But to do that, you need to use what's called the data interpreter. We'll talk about my typical workflow for rearranging that Qualtrics data into separate, nicer tables for Tableau import. And then issues that arise if you're trying to bring in both the text responses and the numeric responses, relate them in Tableau so you'll have both of those available for your visualizations. Then finally, we'll also cover how to avoid the pivoting in Tableau and use this program called OpenRefine to transpose the data and avoid that pivot. And it's a nice way to bring both the text and numeric responses together to bring into Tableau. It's also just a generally good tool to learn how to use. So we'll start with hooking to your data live through the Qualtrics Tableau Web Data Connector. A couple things you need to know about that. As I said before, you can only use Tableau Desktop to hook up to this sort of data source. You can't use the free Tableau Public. It's really handy sometimes to have a live connection to your survey data. Say if responses are still coming in, you can be looking at the data before it's complete. It'll just refresh when you want as more responses come in. It's a really nice way to easily import both the textual and the numeric responses to the data simultaneously, to the responses to the questions. So I really like it for that. It's a couple things that I don't like quite as well. One is that the demographic questions don't come in with a nice name. You'll just see them by their ID, so you'll need to know the IDs and maybe change them to a nicer title. And then the Web Data Connector has something that's called the question type, and it's not exactly what we would want for what we were talking about before with, is it a Likert scale question, or what part of the survey is it in? So if you're using this, you may want to think about adding a separate data source that will be your questions table that you can relate to the Qualtrics data. That can give you the things we had before, like question categories, a short wording, any other information you want to add about the questions themselves. So let's go ahead and just connect directly to our data through the Qualtrics Tableau Web Data Connector. When we open up Tableau Desktop, we have to connect to a server, so we go to this More section, and way down on the list we will see this Web Data Connector. That's the last in that section. We do that, they ask for a Web Data Connector URL. Now that's something you need to go to Qualtrics to get to. So if I log into Qualtrics here, this is my certain test project. Go to the section on data and analysis, and you'll get this URL that they want under the export and import button. So we're going to go to export data. You can see all the common file formats. If you go all the way to the end, if you have this Web Data Connector available, you'll have a Tableau tab, and here's the URL that you want. So we're going to click on this. I'm going to hit Control-C or Command-C to copy, cancel out of that, and then I just go back to Tableau and I enter that URL. Now it looks weird. You paste it here and it shows up top. I really don't like you've got all these buttons that you think you need to hit to go forward. All you have to do is hit enter or return and it'll move forward. Then there's also logging in separately to your Qualtrics account. What I do instead is I use this API login token, this really tiny link that's under the login button. If I hit that, now it's going to ask for an API token. That is also something I get from Qualtrics. So if I go back to Qualtrics and I click on my little icon up here and I go to account settings, Qualtrics IDs is the last tab here. And if you haven't created one before, you'll have to hit this generate token button. I already have an API token that I can just double click on to highlight. I can hit Command-C or Control-C to copy, switch back over to Tableau, paste my API token there, and hit login. That worked well, but now we have to make some choices about what data we bring in and some manipulations we do to it. Most of these I don't really want. I want the response. Now the response type, it just has like where they logged in from. What do I really want? I want a recorded date. Maybe that's nice. I don't really need it, but I could bring that in. The response ID is probably the most important one. along with my demographics. This is the respondent ID, so I really need that. I might grab a couple of location things. That's, again, sort of like demographic data, just where they filled out the survey from. Then the really important ones, along with respondent ID, are my demographic questions, and then all of my actual questions that they responded to. Here in this case, I just have one set of questions. It's just a block of questions that are my Likert scale. And it's at this point that you see up here, there's a checkbox for which of these do we want to transpose. We want to transpose anything that we would have done a pivot on in Tableau if we were bringing this in directly from an exported spreadsheet. Okay, in this case, it is just this one section. But basically, I would put a check next to any of my regular non-demographic questions. I would scroll down here, select all of those. Once you've selected all those and hit which to transpose, I just import the survey questions. Come in, it looks like a normal interface at this point. I can hit update now and it'll actually display a preview of the data. We can see our location. These are our demographic questions. And like I mentioned before, one thing I don't like is that they just come in as an ID. So I will end up renaming these probably for my gender and region and generation. Here's my question IDs. Question description is kind of the wording of the question. Question type, this is where I would kind of like it to be Likert scale something, but it just says matrix. It's how you constructed these questions within Qualtrics. And then this is a really nice piece. Here's the numeric version of the answer, and here's the textual version of the responses. So that all looks great, and we can go ahead and go in and start visualizing just like before. If we were going to try to join in another table that would be a questions table, we would just add another data source, say an Excel workbook or some CSV file that contained our questions table. We could make a relationship. It would work just like before when we related the questions table to our main responses. In this section, we'll talk about the situation that comes up quite often where you're going to use data that you've exported from Qualtrics. So when you've exported a comma-separated value, tab-separated value, or Excel workbooks from Qualtrics, this is for basically when your survey is already complete, just because the data is going to be static. But we can do everything we're going to be talking about here in Tableau Public as opposed to the Web Data Connector, which was Tableau Desktop. So a few things we'll talk about. First of all, trying to use those exported files, those exported spreadsheets directly in Tableau, because the column headers are sort of a different structure than is ideal. We need to use something called the data interpreter. We'll also talk about the rearrangements that I would typically do to the data to separate the tables, get them in a nicer form, more like we used in the hands-on part of the exercises. And then we'll also talk about if you want to take these exported tables and join the textual and numeric responses together in Tableau, how to make those relationships and some of the issues that come up. When you want to export your data from Qualtrics, there's a few different options that are available. Here I've gone into my sample survey that I have in Qualtrics. We're going to hit the button called Export and Import, say Export Data. Now we have some different format options. Comma-separated values, I like the little help text they give you down here saying that you might have some problems opening these in Excel because the CSVs that come out of Qualtrics use UTF-8 encoding for non-ASCII characters, and that's not what Excel is necessarily going to do by default. So they recommend using the tab-separated value instead of comma-separated value. This works a little bit better if you're ever going to bring it into Excel, which we might want to do. And then there's the Excel format itself, which works pretty well if you're going to be separating tables in Excel and do that. They just give you the warning that if you have a very large number of responses, that tab separated value is going to be a little faster. And that in general is true with Tableau as well. The import on really large data sets is much faster with a text file like a CSV or a TSV. Okay? So when we want to export these, unfortunately we have to separately download the text and the numeric responses, but it's pretty easy. You just hit download, you switch it, say where you want to save it, switch to the numeric, download again. I've downloaded both the TSV and the Excel versions. I guess you can see what that looks like. It goes and it will generate the download. Then it looks like in your web browser you're doing a download. It puts it into a zip file, which you have to unpack, but that's not that hard. So when we get that, now we can either try to use those files directly in Tableau or transform them a little bit. Let's take a look at the form the data comes out of Qualtrics because it's a little different than the sample we saw before. Then we'll take a look at what we need to do if we're going to be bringing it into Tableau. So when I open up one of these files, this happens to be the text responses for our little toy sample survey. You can see we've got a lot of columns. Some of these just show up as pound signs because the columns are a little bit too narrow, but we've got dates, lots of information about where people were logged in from, their location. But the main data that we want is this, we've got, where is it? So our respondent ID, response ID is there, unique response ID for each of our people that took the survey. We've got our demographic questions, and then at the end, our regular Likert scale questions. Okay, but the main thing I want you to notice here is that we've got actually two different headers here on each of the columns. Now, some of them look pretty similar. Response ID just written in two different ways. But when we get to the questions, we have one row for the question ID. So Q2 is my gender, and then the kind of the title of that question, gender there. I've got location, but I've got Q3 in location. So we've got question ID, and then the wording of the question is underneath that question ID. That's not the format that we had before. We had the IDs and the wording of the questions in a separate table, and Tableau doesn't really like complicated headers. It likes to have one column name per column and then the data, but it can deal with some of it. So let's see what we need to do to import this. I guess I'll also say that when we look at the tab separated values, it's not the default for mine, but I'll open that up in Excel. Notice that the tab separated values, it looks very similar to the Excel output. Got start date, but look at this, we've got even a third row of kind of header information of extra metadata about those questions. So for every column in this case, go to one of our regular, got our ID, the name or the wording of the question, and then some metadata in a, looks like JSON format about that. And then our real data starts in the third row, okay? So that's a little complicated, but let's go into Tableau. I'm back in Tableau Public. Let's try to connect to this. So if I connect to an Excel file, get to where this data is, my Qualtrics output. Okay, so let's connect to the text output in the Excel format. If I open that up, looks like any other time when we import spreadsheet, the data is down here. There was only one sheet in each of these workbooks, so it just automatically shows up. Everything sort of looks okay, but we see here our doubled up headers. There's no real way to just tell Tableau to start with the third row and to use one of these as the top, but there is some smart tricks they built into Tableau, because this situation comes up a lot. They have this kind of magic checkbox called Use Data Interpreter. It says Data Interpreter might be able to clean your Microsoft Excel workbook. Okay, so if we check that, now it takes a second to interpret it, but now we see that the data looks great. We have one name for each of the columns. Our data is in the columns itself. But if you look at what it had to do, it had to combine the information from both of those rows. Q2 and gender are now together. Q3 and location are together. Our IDs and the wording, if I hover over it, it'll show me the whole wording. That is now the column name, but we have another issue that there's a character limit to that. So if you see at the end of this text, if I hover over it, it says, or if I double click, good job SKI. It's supposed to say good job skills, but because this question, the wording is really long, it ended up cutting off the end of it. So this isn't the end of the world. We've got some important pieces, and we were able to at least bring this in directly. And we can do exactly the same thing that we normally do, which is select all of the real question columns, go to pivot, and now I've got what's basically like my question ID and wording in one column, and I've got the response labels in the other the pivot values. Okay, so I can bring these together. I can use the data interpreter. I can get to a pretty good spot, but there's one issue here that you see this question ID wording has both the ID and the wording in here. I can split this column. I can say, okay, I want to split it on the first space. So I will do a space character in this custom split. I'm going to split off the first column, say okay. Now I've got a column that is basically just the question ID. I got the question ID, so that's kind of nice. But if we want to create a separate questions table, Tableau will not let us build a relationship on this split out column. Okay, so if you just want to bring the data in, you just want to make some quick visualizations, use the data interpreter. It works great. There's even ways to join together the text and numeric responses. There's some tricks to that, but it works. But it's just not going to do some of the things we did before in terms of making a relationship with with a separate questions table. But otherwise, it works just fine. In this section, I'd like to go over the typical data manipulations that I do on the raw Qualtrics output before I try to bring it into Tableau. I'm going to deal with the Excel versions that I have exported from Qualtrics. Just going to double click on those to open them up. So here's my textual version. I have my numeric version behind. If I am going to form relationships between multiple tables in Tableau, the easiest way of doing that, and gets around some problems that I have, it's easiest if I have them as separate sheets within the same workbook. Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just make sure I save the original version of both sets of data. This is my original text. I'm going to make a new sheet, go over to my numeric version, select all, copy, back to this one, paste in here. So this is my original numeric data for the Likert scale responses. You can see them here and the demographics questions. Now, first of all, I want to make sure I save this file as a new name so I don't overwrite my original exported data. So I'll call this maybe the working version of my data. I already had a version there that from another try, so I'm going to write over that. All right. So these are my original versions, just so I don't get mixed up. I'm going to close my numeric one. Now, any manipulations I make, I really want to make copies of these data. I want to preserve this. So I tend to do that by right-clicking on that tab at the bottom, and I go to Move or Copy, and then I say Create Copy. Okay, so this is a copy of my text version. I'll go ahead and do that same thing with my numeric version. Create a copy. Okay. All right. Now, this manipulated version, I'll maybe call this something like data underscore text. And the numeric data underscore numeric. All right. Now, I want to do a few things. I want to take the information from the headers here, these multiple headers where I have the question ID, and then below it I have the wording. Tableau just wants a single column name, a single row at the top that's the name of the columns. So I want to get rid of these double rows at the top here. I also want to create a questions table that I'm going to join together with this response information once I'm in Tableau. Okay? So to do that, I want to take all this information, but it's sort of in the wrong form right now. Let's go ahead and make a new sheet, and let's call this the questions table. I might put that, well, I'll maybe keep it next to it for now, just so it's handy. All right. I want to take these first two rows. I want to copy those, so I'm going to hit Command-C or Control-C on Windows. And then I want, instead of these being across the column headers, I want these to be rows in this table. And so before I've done anything else, after I hit copy, I'm going to go to my new sheet, go to paste, and I'm going to paste special in a way called transpose. When I do that, you see it has changed the shape, so now everything's going down rather than across. And I have what's basically my question IDs here and the question wordings plus the sort of the type of question it is. Okay. Now, I also have a bunch of extra columns here that I'm not going to use, and it'll just kind of make my life simpler if those are gone before I come into Tableau. So I'm going to delete all of these columns before the respondent ID. I'm going to highlight those by dragging on the letters above the columns, right-click, and say delete. I've just got a bunch of blanks for other things that aren't relevant. I'm going to delete those, and then I think I'll leave the latitude and longitude just for the heck of it so you can see that there. But then I'm going to delete these distribution and language columns. And then now I'm left with my respondent ID, some demographic information, and then the responses to my Likert scale questions in this toy example. All right. Do the same thing to the data numeric. I don't want to touch the originals. Maybe I'll move those over. So the data numeric, I'm going to delete the same columns. Delete those. Delete those. And those two. Okay. So now this is looking pretty good, except I still have the double column headers. In the end, what I want, what we saw in the hands-on section with that other example, is I don't really need the question wordings here. Those are going to come from the questions table. Okay. So at this point, now that I have taken the information out of these double headers, I'm going to just delete this second row that has the question wordings in it. Okay. I think I also may get rid of the formatting here. I highlight everything by clicking up in the corner. There's this section for clearing, and I just want to clear the formats. Okay, that's just so it's a little bit more regular. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to save along the way, save my file, Data numeric, same thing. I'm going to get rid of the question wordings and click on all of this and clear the formats. So those are looking pretty good. Now let's work on the questions table. I'm going to go ahead and clear the formats there as well. And now the questions table actually doesn't need any of the demographic information. These are just for our actual responses to the survey. So I can start by deleting all of these rows up to the beginning of my actual questions for my survey. So I'm going to right click, hit delete on that. Now I'm going to need some column headers here. So let me insert another row here. And I know I'm going to want to call this question ID. But let's take a look at this second column that we have here. This has a combination of information in it. We've got indicate the degree to which you agree. So that's kind of the type of question or maybe the section of the survey that I'm in. That qualities are important in a potential romantic partner. That's kind of part of the question wording, but this is really the question wording part that I want to preserve. I don't care about the in-between sections. So in this particular case, what I want to actually do is split these two things apart and get rid of something in the middle. Now, my typical approach to this would be to highlight the cells that I want to manipulate and then split this into two columns on a certain character, like this hyphen or dash character. I could do that by going over to the Data tab, hit this Text to Columns, and this is delimited, so there's a certain character that I want to use to separate each of the fields. I go to Next, and usually the default is Tab. I've been doing some work in here, but the one that I want to use is I want to check Other, and then I just type in the dash character or the hyphen. Usually that would be blank at the beginning. Okay. When I do that, if I hit Next, it's just letting me define what types of columns they are. I don't care about that, so I can just hit Finish from any of these points. Now this looks okay. I've got my good job skills. This is really long. Good sense of humor or over there. But look, we've got an extra space at the beginning of this, of all of these entries. And we still have the extra stuff after the word agree over here. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I would get around that in one step and just make this splitting a little easier. I'm going to have to do some sort of search and replace later to get rid of the stuff. I don't really want to manually delete all of it because maybe this is a long set of questions. I want to get rid of all of this stuff anyway. So let's just replace all that with a single character right from the beginning, and then we can do our splitting and we won't have that extra space. So I'm going to highlight all of the questions I want to manipulate. I'm going to take the text that I want to replace, which is everything after agree and up to the beginning of my question wording. I'm going to hit Command C or Control C to copy that. I'm going to highlight these, go back up to replace, and then I paste in that text that I copied. I want to replace all of that with some certain character that I'm going to split on. I could choose a semicolon, I could choose another dash. Let's do this. Let's replace, say, with a semicolon. I just need it to be a character that doesn't show up in any of those wordings. I say replace all, tells me how many replacements. I close. Now we can see that each of these pieces of text is ready to split on that character. So I'm going to highlight or select all the cells. I'm going to do this, go to Text to Columns. Again, this is delimited by a certain character. And in this case, I'm just going to choose semicolon. I could put in whatever character I used there, hit Finish. And now I've got what I'm going to call my question wording. Wording is here. And then this is maybe the question category, something like this. Now my questions table is almost complete. I would maybe want to put another column, like if this is which section of, say, of the survey we're in, I might want to put the question type as a separate column. And so this is where I would put yes, no, or check all that apply. Or here I could say Likert And I want to say that it's a 5-scale Likert. And then sometimes I'll have 5-scale Likert questions that some are about agreeing, some are about importance. So I'm going to say Likert 5 agree. And then I can just, as long as this doesn't end in a digit that it's going to increment as I go down, I can just highlight the cell that I want. If I'm right next to the rest of my data, I can double click on this little square on the corner and it'll fill it all the way down. So at this point, I'm pretty much ready. I could bring this into Tableau. I could do the pivot on these questions. I could join it in or form the relationship with the question table. But I want to go ahead and show you if I wanted to have a separate demographics table here. Sometimes if I know I want to update information about the demographics later on, supplement it with other data, I might want the demographics in a separate table. So let's see if I did demographics here. All that is the version of these. I need to keep the respondent ID because that's what I'm going to use to join together my responses with the demographics. I'm going to copy this and paste it over into my demographics. So that's my demographics table. Let's widen that out so you can see it. Those are my demographics. And then I am going to keep a version of this that is just the responses. So my data text, I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to move to the end, create a copy. And let's go ahead and do it with the numeric as well. I'm going to create a copy that I'm going to move to the end. This one I'm going to call response text. This one I'll call response numeric. And here I still need the respondent ID, but I don't need any of the demographics information anymore. Okay, so I just need the responses to my questions in the text form. Same thing with the numeric. I'm going to get rid of any of those, the demographics. And now I'm all set with questions, demographics, response text, response numeric, all in their own versions. I make sure I save this. I've got a lot of flexibility now in what I could bring into Tableau. We've seen in the hands-on demo that we can bring the responses or the data with the demographics into Tableau in this wide form and use Tableau's pivot feature to get the data from this wide format into the tall or tidy format that Tableau wants to do the visualization and analysis. Okay? There are times when I prefer to do that manipulation on my own separately from Tableau. Usually that's so I can bring both the textual and numeric versions of the responses in all at once without having to do a pivot, without having to form the relationship between those tables. It just makes things a little simpler. I really don't always do this, but when I want to, I use a program called OpenRefine. I also do it in Python sometimes, but I want to show you how you can use OpenRefine to do what in OpenRefine is called a transpose across columns into rows to make that tall version. If we start up OpenRefine, it's an open source program. If we go to openrefine.org, you can see you can download this. It talks about what it does. It's really great for cleaning data, for clustering, for making facets, for exploring your data a bit, connecting data to sources on the web. There's a lot of things that OpenRefine can do, the text clustering that can do, just a lot of different versions. You download it from here, and when you open the program, it's a little funny in that it opens the interface in your web browser. Now, it's not sending any data over the web. Everything is running locally. If you do this on Windows, you see that it actually opens up a little terminal window that you just leave open that sits in the background. On a Mac, it doesn't open that. It just starts directly. But It's just running on your local computer. It's just the interface is in the web browser. Okay. The first thing we do is we choose the file that we're working on. Here, I just navigate to my Qualtrics output. I'm going to take this working version of the data that I did in the last video section. I choose that, and now we click Next. And OpenRefine is pretty smart about looking at what type of file it is, trying to parse the data. One thing that I find pretty annoying is that the default is that if you have an Excel workbook, it will try to open all of the sheets at once. Okay, this is the section where we're telling it how to interpret the data, and it opens up all the sheets. So I deselect all, and I'm going to just choose the text version of the responses. Once I do that, I can see it looks pretty good. I've got my column headers here as column headers, got all of my different columns. They look good. Most of these options are going to be just fine. To get to the point where I actually do the manipulation, I hit this button over here called Create Project. And again, the interface for OpenRefine is just kind of odd, so it takes a while to get used to, but it's a super useful program. When it opens the data, it will display it like a regular spreadsheet. You can't see it here because I only have 10 rows of my data, but it's actually not showing all of the data necessarily if it's a lot of data. I can click how many rows to show at once, and that's because it's displaying it in a web browser, which is not very efficient for showing huge amounts of thousands, hundreds of thousands of rows. It would bog down the browser. So you can set how many rows you're going to look at once. Here are my columns. The operation I want to do is to take all of these, what are column headers, make them into one column, and then take all of the responses from the body of these columns and make them into a second column, just like we did with the pivot operation in Tableau. I do that by clicking on, each column has its own little menu. I'm going to click on the first column that are my questions. I'm going to go down to transpose and transpose cells across columns into rows. When I do that, it brings up this other dialog. You can see if I hadn't selected the right columns, I could do that here. I could select from there till this last one or till the last column. What I want is to create two columns out of this. The first one is going to be, just like it says here, it contains the original column's names. This I'm going to call it question ID. And then the value column is going to be the response. Let's call it text. One important thing that you have to do, this fill down in other columns is not checked by default. You really want to check that so that the things that get repeated, which here is going to be the respondent IDs, those don't just sit up on their own and have a bunch of blanks below them. It'll repeat them down to the next one. So then I hit transpose. And now I have much more data than 10 rows, so I can display more of it. We see the question IDs and then the respondent ID repeats. We've got all of that. It's in the correct form. I could page to other parts of the data, go to the last one. This all looks fine. At this point, I just want to export this. I tend to do just an Excel format, so I'll choose Excel with the newer workbook format. It has to sit and think for a while, and then it basically, quote, downloads the file. And so it'll show up in your downloads. It shows up here. Again, this isn't going over the web. It's just operating on the local computer. If I take a look at this, or if I open it, now this is just my transposed data. And what I tend to do is just copy all of this and then put it into a new area of my original working workbook. Okay, I'm going to call this responses tall. Maybe I'll put that at the end. Okay, so that's my text versions of the responses. And the nice thing here is that I can pretty easily just go and quickly do the numeric versions as well. So I'm just going to click on this OpenRefine symbol. It'll go back to the beginning. Can close the other download tab. Do the same thing. I'm going to choose the working version. Now again, it'll go through and it takes a long time because I've got a bunch of tabs. I want to deselect all, and here I only want the response numeric version. Okay, I obviously didn't save this in between because I don't see the tall one. Okay, I select the numeric version. That looks good. It's interpreting the column headers right. Create project. Going to go to the menu on the first actual question here. Transpose cells across columns into rows. I want question ID again, and this one I want response numeric. And again, fill down in other columns. I hit transpose. This looks good. I've got all my data there. Just going to export the Excel version. When I open this up, again, copy all of this, and now I want to paste this right next to the text versions of the responses. And in principle, I've got extra information here. I've got my response ID and my question ID that gets repeated. And so the natural thing to do, and it may be safe enough to do, is to just delete the response ID and the question IDs from here. But I really like to make extra sure that something strange hasn't happened and we didn't get some misalignments between the data. I can go down, I can see, okay, do I have the same respondent ID here? Do I have the same question ID? And things look pretty good, but I usually do an extra check here just to make sure that everything, I want to make sure that my text response really corresponds with my numeric response. And I do that by testing whether respondent ID and question ID both match all the way down. To do that, I'm going to form a calculation in an Excel. I'm going to write an equation. Those always start, I'm going to start right after the data ends, and we'll see why in just a second. I start a calculation with an equal sign, and then I want to do an AND operation because I want to check if these two, the respondent IDs match and my question IDs match. So I do that by saying and we see the syntax here is do each test separated by commas. So my first test is I click on a respondent ID, I have an equal sign to test equality, then I click on the other corresponding respondent ID, I hit a comma, I'm going to do question ID equals this question ID in the same row. I have in the closing parentheses already. Yes. Okay. I just had some problems closing the parentheses there. So this is the correct equation. We can see it evaluates to true. Now again, as long as I'm sitting right next to my other data, I can just double click on the little square next to that selected cell, and I'll copy it all the way down. Now here I can look down and see that all of these are true, because I don't have that much data. You might have a huge survey, and if you have to scroll a long way, I wouldn't rely on myself to look and see whether everything said true all the way down. I used to do a search and replace, or sorry, not a replace, but I used to do a search for the word false. But I realized recently that you can just test whether all of these are true by doing another similar equation or calculation. Right next to it, I say equals, again, and now in the end, I'm just going to click on the G column. And then I'm going to close the parentheses so it just says GG there. I hit return, and this says true. That means that all of these are. Now let's check it just to make sure. If I changed one of these, so instead of _3, this said _2. I hit return. Now one of these is false, and look, this overall one says false. I can undo that. Same thing with a respondent ID. If I put a little X at the end of this, now one of these is false. The overall flag is false. I undo that. I'm back to true. Okay. So this means that all of the matches are good. I can delete those test columns, and then I can also delete the second version of my respondent ID and question ID columns. Now I have both the text and the numeric responses in one table. I can join this up to my demographics through the respondent ID. I can join it to my questions table through the question ID. This is already without even having to do the pivot in Tableau. Make sure I save this, and now I'm ready to go. In the hands-on exercise earlier, we brought in this data revelations data into Tableau in this nice form, but it's the wide format where question IDs are across the top. And we just brought in the text responses into Tableau, and we made them into a tall format by doing a pivot. So we just end up with question ID as one column and the text responses as another column. Then we joined that up or formed a relationship with the questions table before we did our visualizations. Now, in our visualizations, though, what we did to get kind of the equivalent of a numeric version of the response so we could sort our bars or do our slope charts is that we created a calculated field where we said, if certain responses existed, we would have a number. And that works just fine in a lot of cases, but sometimes it's really handy to actually bring in the numeric version of the responses as well, because that has more gradations than we did before. That can just be really handy. Now we saw with the Qualtrics Tableau Web Data Connector, that brought in the numeric versions automatically, but if we want to bring in both the text and the numbers at once while doing the pivot, there are some issues that come up that I want to run you through an example. And the example is the Qualtrics little toy version that I've been using for export, things like that. Notice one difference we will notice one difference once we open that data up, that the data revelations data has, for the Likert scale question block, which is Q134, it has just A, B, C, D for each of the questions. And we'll see we have a slightly different form for those question IDs once we get to our data, which has, if we look at the working version that we did in the data rearrangement, we see the question IDs. Here's the text version of the data. The question IDs in this block, it's Q134 is our block of Likert scale. It has _1, _2, _3. And that's actually going to create an extra type of problem that we want to watch out for. It's not hard to get around, but we want to watch out for when we try to bring this into Tableau. Okay, so let's switch over to Tableau Public. I'm going to connect to the working version of my data that has all these different versions of the tables. We can see that we have the numeric and text version of this one that starts with data, has the demographics at the beginning already. We have our questions table. Let's work with those. So let's drag in first the text version of the data. This looks fine. This looks just like it did, basically, with all the response IDs down here, our demographics questions. But now notice one thing that happens when we bring in data in Tableau that has underscores as part of the column headers or the column names. It by default replaces the underscores with spaces. Now, the reason this is going to be an issue is that if we look at our questions table, we need to be able to join up the responses to the questions table through the question ID, and the question ID in our questions table have underscores in those IDs, not spaces. Okay, so if we just did the pivot here, we would end up with, here if I select all these question columns and I do pivot, I see that what I end up with is spaces in these, and they're not going to join up properly. I'm going to hit undo. There is a way to get around this in Tableau that I just learned about recently. If you go to the menu, there's an option called Reset Name. And if I do that, it puts the underscore back. Now I can do this all at once by scrolling over, selecting all the way to the end, reset names. It resets all of those. Unfortunately, I have to reselect them again before I do my pivot. And now if I say pivot, I end up with my question IDs have the underscores in them. Okay, so that's what we're going to want to do. We're going to want to bring in the text data, reset our names, do the pivot. Then we want to bring in the numeric version of the data and do the same thing. There's another problem we want to avoid. We're doing it in this order. We're bringing in the text, resetting, pivoting before we bring in the numeric, because when you try to bring in multiple tables to form relationships in Tableau that have the same name for the column headers, it will add some extra stuff on. So let's undo back to where I haven't done my pivot yet. I've reset my names. Let's go all the way back. We haven't reset the names. Now we bring in the numeric data. We try to form a relationship. It's never going to show me a data preview until I tell it something to relate, how to form the relationship. So let's use the response ID as the key value that is going to match up between the two. Now if we look here in our original text version, we look at the column headers, they look like the original. In the numeric version, we not only have the spaces, but it adds, when it sees the duplication, it adds this the parentheses and then the name of the table in there. And that actually gets preserved even if I do reset name, it puts the underscores back in, but it leaves those parentheses. And if I highlight those columns and then I do my pivot, it actually preserves that parentheses data numeric in there, and it's not going to do the proper join because I need to do this relationship on both the respondent ID and the question ID to make sure the correct responses get lined up between the text and the numeric versions. Okay, so that's why I go through first. I'm just undoing all the way back to where I just have my text version of the data here. I go back and I'm going to select all of my columns. Going to reset names. Going to select those columns again. It doesn't matter which order I do them in terms of the selection. It doesn't matter which pivot choice I make. I do the pivot. Now I'm going to call this question ID, and I'm going to call this response text. So now I have a nice starting point. Now I bring in my numeric version. Once I bring that in, again, I've got to give it some temporary answer for how we're going to join these things together. So I'm going to do the response ID or the respondent ID as my relationship just for now. This isn't enough. Eventually we need to also join on the question ID. But now, I think when I'm showing the numeric data, I look over here and now look what it has. It has the normal version of the question IDs. I can do the same process. Select all of those using Shift and clicking up there. Select reset names. Now do the same thing again. Let's make sure that looks okay. Yep. So select all of those. Choose pivot. And now I can do question ID, and it won't let me name it exactly the same as the other one, so I need to do something else, like Tableau adds a 1 on the end. So I'll say question ID 1, and then this is the response numeric. Okay, so now I have that relationship, and at this point I have to remember though, this relationship right now is based just on the respondent ID, so it's not going to match up properly between the questions. I need to get that match proper. So to do that, I need to add one more field after I click on this relationship here. I need to add more fields, and here is where I need to choose question ID in both of these. So question ID and question ID 1. Now that's the proper relationship. Those associations are good. And at this point, I can join on my questions table. And this one is just going to be between the question ID here and the question ID in the questions table. Now these match up because I've got the underscores. Everything looks good. I'm ready to do my visualization. Now, before I do my visualization, one thing I often do first is to get rid of any columns that I'm not going to need to see when I'm doing my visualization. It might just kind of get in the way and be confusing. I could leave them in, but I just don't like having too many different entries in my data pane. So in the questions table, I don't really need this separate version of the question ID. I can hide that. If I go to my numeric version, I don't need the respondent IDs from that one. I don't need latitude and longitude, and I'm never really going to use the numeric versions of the demographic information. I also don't need the question ID here, so I'm going to actually hide all of those and just leave the numeric version. Then in my original, I think I'm going to leave all of that. Okay, so now when I go to visualize, I've got less things in my data pane. It's easy for me to do this group by folder again, so I'm just looking at the versions. I don't really care where they came from. And I can do the same sort of visualization I did before. Like if I drag question wording over to rows, and then I would want to look at the count distinct of the respondent IDs. So measure count distinct. Now I've got bars. I want to say color these by the response text. I could change the colors here to, well, let's do the percents first. So count distinct, I'm going to add quick table calculation, percent of total. But now remember, I need to compute using table across instead of table down. Just going to make these a little fatter. And then now we have the numeric versions of our data in here. So there's a couple handy things I can do. One of them is these response texts are right now sorted alphabetically. And before I just dragged them around. Now I have the option of sorting these by a certain field. And that field can be the numeric version of the response. It doesn't really matter what I see here, but I could say like max or min. They should each just have a one. I wouldn't want to do sum necessarily, but max or min both get that. Average, max, or min should get the same value. So ascending puts not at all at the top, down to very high degree. I like that for the beginning part because that's the order I like to have when I assign a palette. So if I do this orange gold, I could say assign palette. It has the lightest at the top down to the darkest, the highest degree. I click OK. And now all I have to do is say sort again, and now sort them descending, and it puts them back in the order. And again, I didn't have to reorder them manually. I also have direct access to the numeric responses for the visualization. So instead of the calculated field, now I can just drag the response numeric up to the columns, change this to an average, and in this version take out the colors. Now I've got the bars denoting the average response. I can use this to sort the responses, and I see them more in a useful order to see the data patterns. And this is where I can do the same steps again. Go to dual axis, switch my count distinct respondent ID, my percentages to bar. Instead, go to average response, select shape. I like the open circles that are white and partially transparent. So that looks pretty good. The last thing that I maybe would do here, though, is might want to think about this axis. This goes up to 4 because the top response for average response was 3.9, but this is a 5-point scale here. So the last thing I might do is edit this axis, and instead of automatic, I could do a fixed scale from 1 to 5. You can always manipulate it a little bit for this top level if you want it to line up exactly with 100%. But this now gives you that sense of where the average response was right on the chart. And I can do the same thing for my line or slope charts, where now I take the question wording, put it on columns, response numeric on rows, switch to average instead, probably put these in order, and now I can do my splits according to my demographic data. Now here, I probably should have renamed these. I've got gender, region, and generation. So if I go back, I can just rename those here just to make it a little easier. Let's say gender, region, and generation. And so here's where I could say do my gender splits, change this to a line, make sure I've got the dots and maybe slightly fatter lines. But that can then help us see our patterns across the data in this very kind of coarse form compared to all the detail we got in the stacked bars, but it makes it much easier for us to look at this splitting across some of our demographic variables and seeing the patterns in that.